Hi, I'm Doug Dallas, President of SKC. We are proud sponsors of the virtual AIHce EXP closing session with special guest Mike Walsh. The AIHA staff compiled several great questions from the audience after the session and recorded a special one-on-one conversation with Mike to share his answers. Thanks for watching.
Mike Walsh, founder and CEO of Tomorrow, gave an insightful closing keynote about the new world we're facing called New Rules for a New World. In it, he presented 3 key points. 1, there is no digital disruption, just digital delivery. 2, there is no remote work, just work. And 3, AI will not destroy jobs, but change them. We had a very spirited question bank, and I've selected some of the most popular and thought-provoking to ask Mike. So you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, so I'm going to toss a reverse mind grenade at you first. What did you think was impossible that proved possible by the pandemic?
I think what I found really extraordinary was that there were so many very traditional, very conservative, and very slow-moving industries that were actually able during the pandemic to not only rapidly integrate new technologies, but innovate under pressure to survive and to do things which, frankly, they've said that were impossible for the last 5 to 10 years. And it just shows you that necessity really is the mother of invention. And I think if it wasn't for the pandemic, we would be in a very different world today than I think we're actually the one we're currently in.
Wow. So technology these days seems to be accelerating at a rapid rate, even more than Moore's law would suggest. Do you think there would be a time of equilibrium between new tech and old tech ways of doing things? It feels often as most generations are in the mode of hurry up and catch up, but never quite seem to get on or ahead of the tech expansion curve. So how do you feel we can mitigate that?
It's a tricky question because I think it tends to be generational to some extent. When you're in the midst of it and you're young, like some of the fantastic students I spoke to earlier today, you don't really notice the technological shifts. It's just part of the normal way of doing things. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're older, no matter what decade you're in, whether it's the birth of the home computer or the kind of the early days of server computing, it feels like the whole world is changing. It feels almost apocalyptic. So I think it's unfortunately one of the side effects of age is that we become a little more resistant to step changes in technology. So I think this is just really part of the story of human history. We are always inventing more and more sophisticated tools. And there's always going to be a proportion of the population that will be more resistant to that.
It feels like, too, that part of how you integrate with technology also depends on what you like and dislike and what your skill set is geared towards. So like for me as a creative, I am all in on new technology that helps advance the creative process. But when it comes to like kitchen equipment, I tend to be old school and be very resistant to doing like the newfangled, automated systems. So I feel like that's a subset of an entire
It is. I mean, your skills, capabilities, or knowledge can provide a kind of an entry path into something that's even quite confronting because you can immediately see how it applies. And I think that's a good lesson because if you can always find ways to relate that technology to what you do and see it as a positive, it'll make it easier for you to accept it. But that said, technology for me really succeeds, not when it becomes more complex or sophisticated, but when you actually stop noticing it. Mm. And I think this is really where things are changing, and they're going to be more change in the next few years because our interfaces to technology will change rather than very few of us use command line interfaces anymore. We use icons. Very soon, very few of us will use screens. We will use voice activation or augmented reality. So these interfaces with time get more natural. They become more abstracted. And when this happens, I think a lot of the resistance to new systems starts to disappear.
So in relation to all of that, how do you think we can overcome the security issues that are associated with the internet? How do we get a life after Google? I mean, what does that entail?
I don't think there's ever going to be an endpoint where security is resolved. There's kind of a constant struggle between good actors and bad actors, and that struggle, it will increasingly be played out with artificial intelligence and bots and systems. So will be literally bad AIs, not in that they are anthropomorphized and have come to life, but in that hackers and people trying to penetrate security systems will leverage machine learning systems with greater degrees of sophistication, which means on the other side, companies and organizations and countries trying to protect themselves will also use similar AI tools. In fact, they may use the same tools. So it's just going to be an endless struggle for supremacy, which is terrifying. And yet, in some ways, it's also one of those forces that propels evolution and change, and it forces us to become better, basically.
So talking about the epic struggle, several people asked, how do you see the balance of like work and home evolving over the next decade, especially with this inclusion of like showing that remote work really does work, and to the statement that you made that there isn't remote work, it's just work. How do you see that balance? Is it shifting? Is it going to merge? I mean, what are we looking at?
It's a much more complex question, I think, than people appreciate, because remote work is problematic for a lot of people in that they're not set up to actually work like that. And there are a lot of cultural drawbacks when you can't have people together, whether it's running effective agile squads, or it's new people, young people join the organization who find it hard to access mentoring or watching what, the processes. So working from home is not a panacea that sort of fixes 21st century work culture. I think it's a very dangerous way of looking at it. So for me, the real lesson from the pandemic is that it shouldn't matter where you work, in that our tools, our systems, decision delegation protocols need to be able to function and be resilient regardless of location. But once you've got that, the question of where you work needs to be more of a human-shaped one and a culturally shaped one than simply one driven by necessity.
So leading into that, how would communities and workplaces lead the effort to balance a more remote work environment in the cultural sense with a need for that personal interaction that's necessary to establish and maintain trust?
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I observed long before the pandemic is that it's much easier running remote teams when they've actually had a real world interaction or a series of real world actions at some point, because you've got some kind of human context to anchor that virtual relationship with. If you've only ever interacted with someone via Zoom and email, the degree to which you can potentially trust them, the degree to which you would go out of your way to help that person is perhaps subconsciously limited. And we can't help that. We're still analog creatures. That's how we're wired. So I think as we try to balance those two things, we need to purposely design workplaces that are not only safe in an industrial hygiene context, but are culturally appropriate and effective in bringing people together to trust each other, to be more collaborative, and I guess to feel home even at work rather than just be able to work at home.
So how do we build and maintain trust in future virtual systems then?
I think there's two parts to that. One is trust in terms of the implicit social network inside an organization, and that I think really requires often face-to-face interaction. But there's trust also in terms of the protocols, the systems that protect a workplace or its virtual systems. And I think that will increasingly rely on machines and artificial intelligence and data to augment our capabilities in protecting those environments. And like I said, a great example of that, very simple, is how we're seeing the use of computer vision in warehouses and workplaces and retail to maintain social distancing. I mean, yes, you can have someone there literally all day, um, uh, like almost like dance hall monitors, making sure people don't get too close together. But much more effective if you can just train security cameras to do the same thing.
So are we going to have greater consequences or challenges with specifically with cybersecurity in an AI type of future?
It's hard to imagine that we won't. If you can imagine really be able to scale up bad actors, and take the kind of already quite sophisticated bot attacks we have today, and combine them with very sophisticated systems that can constantly be testing and learning from our attempts to push them out. You've got a nightmare scenario. I mean, when you look at the profile of a number of big cybersecurity attacks in recent years, they're often penetrating through HVAC systems or industrial systems, because not only sometimes are those systems the least hardened, there's such a complex ecosystem of vendors and providers and security contractors, and it's very difficult to really lock all of that down. But that's exactly what we have to do, and we're probably going to need AI to help us.
Do you feel then that IT and cyber technology is going to be more of an important skill set within the OEHS toolbox?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way we're going to see the rise of the computational industrial hygienist, right? Which is someone who has the same skills, knowledge, passion for the industry, but they also have a toolbox of technical capabilities up their sleeve as well. It doesn't mean that they can program or use TensorFlow necessarily, but it means that they understand enough about these systems that they can integrate that into their decision making or workflows or processes, be able to partner with AI factories inside the organization or tech teams, and see opportunities to bring other organizations or individuals in to transform how they do things.
Wow, that's actually a fascinating new way to look at the profession and how it can evolve. So let's turn a little bit here, and who's asked, how do you see the future of emergency response, especially in specifically to rural and urban communities?
It's an interesting question. I remember years ago when I was in Brazil, I came across these giant command centers that they were building in Rio. And the idea was that Rio was like this extreme city where every kind of disaster you could imagine, from attacks and crime to mudslides. I mean, it was like the city was in a state of constant assault. And IBM had partnered with the city to build. This is going back about 10 years ago. Very sophisticated real-time command modules. Where you could basically not only see from a data perspective the entire city, you actually brought together all of the emergency services into one place, fire, healthcare, police, and it allowed a unified data-driven response. And that was 10 years ago. And I think now in places like China, you're seeing the creation of these city brains where you've got that same concept, but all of those data streams are now also moderated by artificial intelligence, where the AI is constantly screening and looking for interrelationships and trying to almost intervene before something gets to a crisis scenario.
So do you think like that adoption of these central like hub or regional hub areas that are more fueled by AI tech, like probably within the next 10, 20, maybe 50 years?
I think it's sooner than that, because especially in rural areas, I think there's going to be the opportunity to try to essentially use AI and data to preempt situations, long before they're really critical. I mean, if you look at flooding, for example, so being able to really understand an area, understand the triggers, understand what potentially drives an emergency outcome before it happens, extreme weather events. You could potentially use that in conjunction with regional hubs, these data hubs,
Right.
to preemptively try to prepare for events before they happen.
Okay.
It's kind of like a Minority Report, right? It's like an emergency pre-crime.
Yeah, yeah. It's, I guess, in more of the line of like, I guess there was a show on a few years ago called Person of Interest where AI would like calculate the odds of different incidents happening and then trying to preemptively fix that.
Yeah.
I guess these ER teams would be looking at all kinds of natural and demographic data and just trying to figure out hotspots and things like that.
Yeah, and then I think where Person of Interest sort of got it wrong a little bit. It's almost impossible to predict the actions of an individual.
Right.
Um, but at a macro level, I think it's often quite clear. And actually, strangely enough, this was the premise of Asimov's Foundation books. If any of you are sci-fi fans, you know that
Mhm.
uh, psychohistory, he called it, which is you can't predict individual behavior, but if you look at statistical movements at a larger scale, whether it's whether it's disasters or flooding or tornadoes, you can get a fairly strong sense of what might happen under what conditions.
Which I think is really important for OEHS to remember because a lot of the science they deal with works in that statistical atmosphere so
Yeah.
that they are much better because it's more reliant on, the age of a property and the schematics and the technology that's involved with all of the infrastructure and everything else. And then the human factor is part of that, but also like that entire environment can be somewhat predictable.
And actually, this is one of the best reasons why artificial intelligence and machine learning should, at least conceptually, should come naturally to people in the industry. Because in the end, AI is nothing more than just a statistical model, and it's easy to glamorize these things sometimes, but that's really what it is. These are massive probabilistic statistical models that are making recommendations but based on patterns of data.
So another question that we had was, there's a comment that we rely on body language and other cues that aren't easily translated via electronic connection. This full body communication is important. They feel is very important in building trust and ensuring program success when they're communicating to employees and workers and upper management. So that said, considering this more digitized or digital communication and networking, how do you feel relationships in the future are going to look?
Uh, I don't. Like I said, I don't think we're going to see the end of face-to-face communication. I just think that uh, we're in this hybrid stage at the moment where what we've done is take our physical interactions and move them onto screens, which is less than ideal. I mean, it's like we took our endless meeting culture and we just added video cameras, which to me is a recipe for nightmare. Because it was bad enough sitting in a useless meeting before, but now there's a camera trained on you to see if you're paying attention.
Right,
It's
right.
sort of a panopticon nightmare. So what I think we're going to figure out in the future is that there are a lot of meetings that don't need to take place that can be replaced with smarter automation, smarter transactional systems, basically non-human interactions. And there's a lot of meetings that do need to take place, and they need to take place in person because they're about consent, they're about brainstorming or creativity, or they're about relationships and trust or getting to know someone. And that will take place probably in a redesigned workplace that is less focused at doing task-based work and more focused on building relationships.
Mhm.
Because in those times where you are doing very task-driven work that requires concentration and non-interruption, you should be at home, but not home with a video camera and a screen.
Right.
Because now we've got this situation where people spend all day in Zoom meetings or WebEx or Teams, whatever else it is. And then once all of that finishes, then they commence their workday doing the stuff that they couldn't do because they're being in these endless video chats.
Yeah. One of the concerns that was brought up, and you touched on it briefly, is this fact that these face-to-face communications really help with the trust level. And a lot of, especially with this last year, there's been less trust in science because of various factors. And they felt that with the way they were concerned that if they're moving into a virtual, that trust would be a lesser thing. And then how do they communicate better to workers who trust their expertise, but yet they're not able to establish that in a meaningful way that they used to? So what would be like some of the things that they could look at in future-proofing that and continuing to establish trust with workers and upper management?
I I don't think there's any shortcuts. There's not a quick fix to this. You have to, uh, when it comes to relationships, I think you just have to design it into the process. And a big thing, and I think I referred to this when I was talking about Google, in that it's not just trusting each other; it's trusting systems. And especially when you're working virtually or people can't actually be there and there's more remote setups, you need to be able to provide the people who are responsible for the safe operation of a system
Mhm.
uh, influence over the design and the controls of it. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be physically in control of these systems. As we saw with Google's HVAC systems in its data center, if you can give those safety engineers the ability to design the protocols that the AI system use, then they're also comfortable letting the AI system in control. But you need to have some kind of process by which humans are involved in designing the system.
So in your talk, you mentioned seamless integration between physical and digital businesses, or we're all disruptors now. So how does that work in relation to businesses and agencies that are tied to infrastructure, such as trade goods, transportation, construction, more of the trades, the trade?
Yeah. So the industrial sector as a whole has been one of the slowest to really adapt new technologies, whether it's sensors and data and artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation. But it is, as it starts to move and wake up, it is probably the sector that's most interesting to watch because it is the infrastructure that runs our world. And as we saw in the recent blocking of the Suez Canal, when these things go wrong, they don't just go wrong in a local area; they can shake the world economy.
Yeah.
And and I think that's why, though we've talked about for years Industry 4.0 and the industrial Internet of Things, uh, this isn't hype. This is really the new world that's coming. That's going to change the way we design supply chains, the way we kind of measure and run markets, the way we design organizations. And that isn't just massive machines connected to each other. That includes, as you say, the trades, the people on the ground, the people on the construction site, the people driving trucks. They're actually part of that same system. And I referenced that company that was putting cameras on hard hats. So they were literally kind of building a digital twin of a construction site as it was being built. And this is not just useful for compliance on PPE or like people wearing appropriate clothing. It allows you to kind of change the way you finance these projects because you've got a real-time completion model, which people can then use to draw down, bank loans. So I think every aspect of the industrial world is going to become digitized and virtualized, and that data will really transform the way we build and operate our infrastructure.
So for those who are involved more in that industrial sector, it's more about changing your perspective slightly to see how AI and technology and these future concepts could actually, even if it just impacts one aspect of their work, such as putting a camera on a hard hat, then what opportunities are open from that?
Absolutely, and I think it's not to see it in a binary way, which is
Right.
okay. We have technology now. We're not going to need the person with a monkey wrench in the boiler suit. But it is a warning because it does mean we are going to need to upgrade our capabilities, and um, people in that industry and in that space will need to be more comfortable. And there are going to be times when you've got an emergency repair or a change on a production line, and the expert is sitting 1,000 miles away, and you're going to be connected with them via augmented reality, and they're going to be showing you stuff, and you've got to be fine with that. But that's already happening in sophisticated manufacturing sites. If you look at Raytheon or some of these big industrial manufacturers in aerospace, they're already using augmented reality glasses, which tell them exactly how many times to turn a bolt, for it to be the tension to be exactly right.
Yeah.
So those kind of technologies have been in place for years already.
Yeah, I like the example used in the talk about the cotton industry at the turn of the Industrial Revolution. So I think that was, in a way that's applicable, 100 years later, here we are looking at that same type of innovation where they're not putting workers out of work. They are transforming what they do to better build upon their skills and still make them an integral part of that business. So, okay. So let's look at early career professionals in this field. We already talked about how cyber tools and cyber technology skill sets could be a tool in their toolbox. What other skills or even just opportunities do you think would be helpful for someone coming into the profession now? How can they stay on top of changes as things continue to rapidly evolve? So how can they continue to stay relevant? What would you suggest?
I think there's two suggestions I would make. One is it is imperative to kind of build up your technical knowledge in these new areas, and it doesn't mean, like I said, you need to program, but there isn't a vast amount of information online. There are courses, there are blogs, there are books, there is any number of resources that can allow you at least to get a grounding on these techniques and technologies and platforms, which, as we discussed, given that you probably already have a solid grounding in statistics, should come as no surprise. But the second thing is more practical, which is that there is a real opportunity here to be a pioneer, which is to identify companies and technologies and software which, if they don't already directly address your problem set, they might be similar enough that you can partner with them to potentially experiment in your organization. So rather than looking for the perfect case study to justify, more innovation in this area, be the case study. Sell management on a pilot. And chances are, given how early this is, you may actually end up as one of the world's experts in this area just because you're the first person to do it.
Oh, that's interesting. That's actually a good tack to take.
Because honestly, if you wait till it's obvious, it's going to be so commoditized that you're probably already behind.
Will the increased pace of work and decision making as things move forward, will that exceed human capacity to adapt? And do you think that would lead to an increase of psychological stress? How is that something that can be mitigated?
I think Zoom has given us psychological stress. And that's not exactly particularly sophisticated. So I think we're great at designing stressful work setups, even without complex technology. I'm an optimist in that I think even as we develop new and more sophisticated tools that have the potential to replace us, we seem very capable at upgrading our own talents and our own capabilities to the extent that we stay just a little bit ahead. And this, I think, is the story of human history and civilization, that we are always able to stay just a little bit ahead of the very tools we create that seem to threaten us. And there is a generational pushback often, and this is nothing new. But we just have to recognize that and realize that while younger generations may more intuitively grasp these changes, we have the benefit of straddling those two worlds, the world before and after that innovation, which can provide really useful context to kind of shape that journey. So both generations are critical, I think, in that constant evolution of human capabilities.
Okay. And last thing, what is your most wildest prediction for the future of work that you'd like to share? And we promise we won't hold you to it.
This is a tricky one because it's not inevitable, but it's something that may be desirable ultimately, which is none of us will work for organizations in a full-time context anymore. You're basically going to have everyone as a form of contractor governed by smart contracts. And so your career will not be a steady progression through an organization. It'll almost be like you're picking up experience points in a game, working with many different projects, many different organizations, different markets, different industries. And people will essentially look at the kind of the blockchain of your career progression, and that's will be how you're paid and remunerated. But the idea of you working for a company and I don't know how long this is going to take, it may take 20, 30 years, but that model of working for an organization will be as weird as saying you used to ride a horse to work.
Although I dare say that Gen Z and millennials they're already moving in that direction. So it's not going to be as weird to them.
Yeah, but you know what? Being a social media influencer will be also just as weird and as funny in the future.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. This has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of follow up a little bit with all this, Mike. Any last words, any last thoughts you want to share with the audience before we go?
I think we covered it.
Okay. Thanks. And please enjoy the rest of your day.